Today we're testing NVIDIA's RTX 3090. This is their flagship GPU for the current 30 series generation of GPUs, and a GPU that they're saying is of Titan level of performance. But unlike Titan cards, NVIDIA have allowed their aftermarket sort of board partners to package them with their aftermarket cooler designs, and that is something that might confuse consumers of what this card is actually meant to do. At $1,500 US, this is the most expensive GPU that I've had on the test bench, and it's the fastest as well, as you could probably expect. But if you're after a high-end gaming GPU or a high-end workstation GPU, how much better is this over the RTX 3080? Is it twice as good, or at least 50% as good? Let's take a look. So let's dive in and take a look at what's different versus the RTX 3080 that we've taken a look at over the last week, and which offered some extremely good performance for the money. The 3090 offers a little over 20% more CUDA cores, RT cores, and Tensor cores than the 3080 at a roughly similar boost clock on paper. The big difference here though is the memory configuration. The 3090 packs a mammoth 24GB of GDDR6X memory with a max bandwidth edging close to 1 terabyte per second. The total board power comes in at 350 watts, and all of that is on offer for $1,500 US. Now that sounds like a lot of money for a GPU, and don't get me wrong, it absolutely is, but let's put this into perspective. The Titan RTX from the last generation came in at $2,500 US and offers less performance on paper at least, and when we compare it to the RTX 2080 Ti, the real difference between them is only around $300 US, and for that difference, the 3090 offers a ton more hardware under the hood. But it really is NVIDIA versus themselves here, because the question that we all want to know as consumers is how much better the RTX 3090 is over the 3080. Is it really worth over double the price? So the specific card that I have here for testing is the RTX 3090 Gaming X Trio from MSI. This is their flagship design, as many of you know, and unlike the 3080, this one has a completely metal backplate with heat pipes underneath. And MSI have really cleaned up their design for this series. The Gaming X Trio looks exceptional, and you can expect a very quiet fan curve out of the box. This card has a slightly higher power limit and boost clock out of the box compared to the Founders Edition, so keep that in mind when we look at the performance. And that is something that we will be comparing, because I do actually have the Founders Edition card right here, and yes, it is absolutely ginormous, and it is the biggest card that NVIDIA have ever produced for a Founders Edition card. I will have a dedicated video on this one going up tomorrow, so make sure you are subscribed. I also do have the Tough model from ASUS following a few days after that, and from what we saw from their 3080 model, I'd expect the performance here to be very good. For now though, let's just jump right into the performance benchmarks, and let's start off with the production workloads first, as opposed to starting with gaming, because I do think that makes sense for this GPU. Let's kick things off with Blender, and here we're looking at a 4K render at 500 samples per tile, and the 3090 beats the 3080 by 14.6%, and a little over a minute saved for this particular scene. This was using CUDA, but let's see if things improve when we switch over to optics, and actually they don't. Here the 3090 was just 13% faster than the 3080, and that's very surprising given it costs over twice as much. So if you have $1,500 to put towards GPU rendering performance in your system, you'd actually be better off with two RTX 3080s. Theoretically, you'd be doubling your rendering performance and beating the 3090 by almost 38%. This is something that I do actually plan to test in a future video. V-Ray gives us slightly more promising results though, over 23% more performance than the RTX 3080, but still not what you'd expect for paying a little over double. Now for video editors, don't expect much faster performance when it comes to export times or video stabilization. The only time that you really need to upgrade to the 3090 is for the absolutely huge VRAM capacity of 24GB. And the use cases that need that amount of VRAM are hard to test for, and usually highly specific. For example, my own video editing demands do sometimes exceed the 11GB of VRAM on my RTX 2080 Ti. That's usually when working with very large projects on a high resolution timeline, while also stabilizing a lot of footage. So that massive video memory capacity would actually be useful to me, and I expect a lot of other DaVinci multi-resolve users working with 6K and 8K footage would say the same thing. We'll come back to this video memory discussion, but for now let's move on to gaming. Let's kick things off with a direct comparison against the RTX 3080 in Red Dead Redemption 2 at 1440p, and I really mean it when I say that Nvidia's up against themselves here. The RTX 3080 not only looks exceptional against GPUs like the RTX 2080 and 2080 Ti, but we're looking at a performance margin of only 12% here between it and the 3090. Sure, it's just 1440p and we might see a slightly larger bump at higher resolutions with the faster memory configuration on the 3090, but 1440p is wildly more popular than 4K. And at 4K, the 3090 is now almost 13% faster than the 3080, now able to exceed over 200 FPS in Rainbow Six Siege completely maxed out, so exceptional performance in a vacuum, but also exceptionally poor value when compared to the 3080 as a gaming GPU. And so far, the RTX 3090 is looking like a Titan tier card in the purest sense. Titan cards have commonly been marketed for production workloads and their very large memory capacities, and have never really offered outstanding gaming performance margins over the top tier gaming cards underneath them. In fact, in Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, there's only an 8% performance margin between it and the 3080, and that's typically a margin that you could close with a beefy overclock. What I find interesting here is when you remove the 3080 from these graphs, the 3090 looks exceptional when compared to the $1,200 2080 Ti. There you're getting almost a 50% performance increase versus a 25% increase in price, and that's actually extremely good value when you're looking at this tier of GPU. But with the 3080 thrown into the mix, the 3090 is a hard sell. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, again completely maxed out at 4K, we see another 12% performance margin in favor of the RTX 3090. And look, I'm not expecting double the performance for basically double the price. No one expects that when you're talking about top tier GPUs, but I think most of us expected at least 30% over the 3080. After all, that's roughly what you get with a 2080 Ti over a 2080. So the 3090 is no doubt the fastest gaming GPU that we've seen, but with consistent performance margins of as little as 13%, it's barely a perceivable difference over the RTX 3080. Again, the 3080 is the real party crasher here. The 3090 is an insanely fast GPU on its own, but it's almost as if Nvidia made the 3080 too fast. There was one interesting game benchmark between these two GPUs though, and that's Battlefield 5. Here we're looking at 4K ultra settings, and again, the 3090 leads by 13%, but the 3090 is the only GPU in this title that I've tested that has shown consistent, stable frame rate performance. The real-time FPS graphs at the top show this clearly, with the 3090 having no small frequent dips in frame rate, which by the way aren't really perceivable on the 3080, only with lower end cards. F1 2020 showed the largest performance lead for the RTX 3090, a 15.7% increase over the 3080. That gets stretched to 16.1% when we factor in DLSS for both GPUs, with both delivering well over 144 FPS at 4K. Now, it's hard to complain about gaming performance here when Nvidia have clearly stated that the 3080 is the gaming flagship GPU and not the 3090. And looking at the results, it's pretty clear why they said that. Lastly, we have Control, with the smallest difference between these two GPUs that I've tested at around 10% in both pure rasterization performance and when factoring in ray tracing and DLSS. Here we're looking at the game at 4K, completely maxed out, and that's enough to reduce both GPUs to under 60 FPS. Both the 3080 and 3090 get a small boost when factoring in ray tracing and DLSS, and at this point the 3090 is just able to edge over an average of 60 FPS. Clock speeds for the MSI Gaming X Trio variant of the RTX 3090 have it settling in at around 1900 MHz, which is only 30 MHz less than what we saw with the 3080 of the same card and cooler design. Nvidia do list a slightly lower boost clock for the 3090 compared to the 3080, so this is what you would expect. The Gaming X Trio has decent thermal performance from what we can see so far, although I haven't compared it to anything just yet, so do stay tuned for the follow-up reviews with the Founders Edition and Asus TUF for comparison. As we saw with the 3080 Gaming X Trio, this card has a quiet fan curve which runs a little bit on the warmer end, settling in at 75 degrees C with the GPU fans at around 1450 RPM. Power consumption is 44 watts over the 3080 when tested in control at 4K. That's not a significant amount, but it's likely going to be enough to push 600 watt power supplies over the edge in more CPU intensive games. I will note that I'm also planning some in-depth content on overclocking and undervolting both the 3080 and 3090 and what effect that has on power, thermals, and overall performance, but that definitely requires its own entire video. So on one hand, it's hard to complain about the gaming performance compared to the 3080 when Nvidia didn't initially position the 3090 as a GPU for gamers, at least with the initial announcement. But then at the same time, recently, really pushing this as a GPU that's capable of 8K gaming, I feel it's a bit misleading. Now, I have absolutely no problem saying that yes, the RTX 3090 could probably game at 8K resolution if you do have an 8K TV or an 8K monitor, which is probably very few of you, I'm guessing, but the problem is that if this is now an 8K gaming GPU and kind of people see the marketing headlines and sponsored content around 8K gaming, people think that, okay, if this thing can do 8K gaming, it can probably absolutely crush 4K gaming and 1440p resolution gaming. In reality, it's only 12 to 14% faster than the 3080 in those resolutions. So I would have liked to see a clear cut in the marketing as to what this GPU actually is. Is it a gaming GPU or a production workload GPU with a ton of VRAM? In the end, who should buy the RTX 3090? Well, if your computer makes you money and you frequently encounter video memory limitations in your current workflow, the 3090 is the single fastest GPU to chew through whatever it is you do. I have no doubt that there are scientists, researchers, and 3D artists out there who are rejoicing at a lower cost Titan equivalent GPU with a huge 24 gigabytes of GDDR6X memory to play with. But for the same price, maybe also consider two RTX 3080s, especially if you use something like Blender or Octane Render, which both do have excellent multi-GPU support. That would be the most effective way to spend around $1,500 towards GPU rendering performance. And I do understand that some workloads don't scale as well or at all with multi-GPU support, so there is a case for the 3090 if you are willing to pay as much as it is. So I'll leave some links down below in the description if you're interested in the 3080 or the 3090, although don't expect stock to be there just right now. Definitely check back in a couple weeks or so. As always, a huge thanks for watching. Plenty of content out around the corner, as you can see. We do also have the RTX 3080 Founders Edition, which Nvidia kindly sent over, and there will be tons of content coming up on these two cards here. So as always, a huge thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.